Okay, so welcome to our webinar this afternoon. I think that I've let everybody in that was waiting in the lobby. So welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon for this webinar on data-driven teacher development and the teacher education dataset. I'm Claire Maud and I'm a research fellow at the NIOT and I'm going to be your host this afternoon. We are joined by colleagues who will each be sharing a different aspect of our data-driven teacher development project, and I will let them introduce themselves when they're speaking. First of all, though, I would like to share a brief introduction to what we do at the NIOT and what you can expect this afternoon. So, our vision at the NIOT is of a school system that nurtures the talents of teachers and leaders at all stages of their careers so that they can provide children with excellent education. Our mission is to improve the quality of teacher and leader development at a system level, and doing research helps us to understand how best to do this. We're also a school-led organisation, so our questions come from teachers and leaders. So I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to all of those involved in the research that we're sharing today and in all of our other research and programmes. This afternoon, we will be hearing about our pilot study for the teacher education dataset, which has shed light on the metrics of teacher impact. Then we will hear about how we plan to build the teacher education dataset and the data practicalities involved, followed by how we will be exploring the data in the Teacher Improvement Through Data and Evaluation project. We will then have time to answer some questions at the end. Please feel free to share any thoughts or questions as we go using the Q&A function, which you should be able to find at the top of your Teams window. Right, so that's enough from me. Thanks again for joining, and I'm going to hand you over now to Professor Rob Coe to share our pilot study with you.
Thanks, Claire. My name is Rob Coe. I work for Evidence-Based Education. I'm the Director of Research and Development. And I've been involved in analysing this data set right from the beginning. So just to give you a little bit of background here, we got data from 3 of the 4 founder MATs in the National Institute, and they shared data with us about student attainment. All of these MATs have standard procedures for assessment, internal assessments, that are common across all their schools or mostly across all their schools, and we matched those to the classes and the teachers and the students who had them. We looked at the quality of the assessments because some people have been concerned about we're using these internal assessments. When I say internal assessments, I mean typically end of year assessments or sometimes termly assessments, depending what the schools and MATs have in place. Are they good assessments? That was one of the questions. And can we use them to estimate value added, by which I mean trying to estimate the amount of progress in their learning that individual classes have made, and therefore teachers are responsible for, or at least arguably responsible for. So we ran some standard value added models, some models that are a bit different, and we tried a whole lot of different ways of doing that. So there's a report of this that's available if anybody wants to see. It's a little bit technical, but it's available as a preprint online, and all the information that I'm going to talk about today is in that report. So the aims of this study, we had 4 broad aims. One was to find out what people thought about this whole process, using these assessment scores to try and track and estimate the progress that individual classes make. Is that okay? How do people feel about that? Is it actually, secondly, feasible? Can we get the data? Does it all look sensible? Can we run the models? That kind of thing. Thirdly, the assessment quality, which I already mentioned. Are the assessments good enough for this purpose? And then fourthly, really about the value-added models. Can we actually run the models and estimate the progress made by different classes, and by inference, the impact that teachers have? And just to say a little bit about the data that we've got, the background. So just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here, as I say, data from 3 of the MATs. Two of them, Mat 1, Mat 3, were secondary, so years 10 to 11, or years 7 to 11, 7 to 10, and Mat 2 was primary, years 3 to 5. Not huge numbers of schools, but quite reasonable numbers of teachers and classes. You can see Mat 3, for example, over 1,000 teachers, 4,500 classes, and over 100,000 results. 17,000 students, so quite large samples there. Now, what did we do with those? Well, so first question was the different stakeholders and what did they think about it? And broadly, I'd say the summary is that they were mostly pretty happy. They had a few slight concerns, so we ran focus groups with these groups of teachers from the MATs that were involved, and we invited them to talk about whatever concerns they had. And they were mostly really positive. They thought this was a great thing to do. They thought it was really worthwhile. They were interested in finding out the results. There were some worries about things like, can we keep it anonymous? Can we make sure it's never used for any kind of consequences attached, capability or performance management or any of those things? We were absolutely clear, and all the trusts involved have been absolutely clear. It can't be used for any of those things. All the data we've got is fully anonymized, for one thing, so we don't know even which schools are which, let alone which teachers or which classes. There are also some interesting concerns about, can we take account of context and things like that, which we'll maybe get onto later on. I think the answer is probably yes, but that's part of what we're still investigating, it's fair to say. So then the second question was about whether we can get the kinds of data. And again, I'm not going to say much about this, but the answer is yes, we did manage to get the data. It was not straightforward, and particularly Claire and Sean and others did a lot of work to make sure that we got the data in the format we needed. There's quite a lot of cleaning and so on, but yes is the answer. And each time we now get a new data set, it's a little bit better. It's more in line with what we want, less glitches. So we're definitely progressing on that. Okay, so question 3 then is about the quality of the assessments, and we did quite a bit of work on this, and I'm really just going to share one slide, one graphic on this, but there's quite a lot more in the technical report, and quite a lot more that we did. So the kind of thing that we're talking about we've got is the this chart shows the correlations between pupil scores on their internal assessments. This is from one of the secondary MATs, the secondary data, where we had about, I think, 300 odd assessments between years 7 and 10. And what we would expect to see is that the pupils who do well on a particular assessment, so it might be in French or geography or maths, that should correlate with their score on their Key Stage 2 assessment from the end of year 6. And it shouldn't correlate too high because it's not the same subject typically, and there's a bit of a time gap, but it should correlate reasonably well. And so our benchmark for this is what happens at GCSE. So at the end of year 11, if you look at GCSE grades, how well do they correlate with Key Stage 2? And the answer is pretty well. In fact, they're all in that green zone between 0.4 and 0.8. So we thought, well, if they're in that zone between 0.4 and 0.8, then they're comparable with GCSEs in terms of how well they correlate with Key Stage 2. Then there's a sort of shoulder zone, which is amber, between 0.3 and 0.4. And below that, below 0.3, we think, well, really that's too low. There's one exception to all GCSEs correlating above 0.4, and that is a handful of community languages. So Urdu is the most common there. So how well people do in exam GCSEs like Urdu don't correlate very well with how well those students do at Key Stage 2 or in their other subjects. So we kind of let that one off, but all the others, including subjects like performing arts, drama, art, PE, where you might think, well, why would that correlate with Key Stage 2? And the answer is that they do. So we think these should too. So what we're saying is that the majority, round about 4/5 are pretty much okay. Some are better than others, but they're all okay. Something like 1 in 5 looks like it's not really quite as good as we'd expect it to be. Obviously, we don't know much about what's in those assessments, but one of the things we hope to do in this project is to feed that data back to the data leads and the assessment leads in the trusts so that they can learn and improve. They can use that feedback and perhaps work with them as well to help them improve the assessments that they're using. So just to summarize then, overall, I think most of the assessments are good enough. One or two, or a small proportion, we're not exactly sure how many, probably could be improved. There's lots we could do to improve that. As I say, we want to work with the trusts and the data leads and the assessment leads to help them do that. And we also hope that if in future we get more evidence, so for example, we haven't been able to correlate any of these secondary assessments with subsequent GCSE grades, but that would obviously be a good test. How if you're taking a year 10 assessment in Spanish, that ought to correlate reasonably well with what you then do in year 11 in your Spanish GCSE, for example. So we will be able to say more about that as we get more data later on. Okay, so then on to the sort of main question of the whole thing, which is about using value-added models to estimate progress. And I want to say a little bit about the value-added models that we've used and how we've estimated them. So that's the next slide, please, Claire. Thank you. We use something called linear mixed models. No need to worry too much about what that is. Slightly different models for the secondary data and the primary data. So for secondary students, we've got typically a baseline, which is Key Stage 2. We've got student scores in typically a range of subjects, so something like 6 to 8 different subjects taken at the same time. We've also got information, demographic information, like their pupil premium, status, gender, SEN, and so on. And then we've also included in the model, or some of the models, an average for the class. So as well as the individual pupils baseline Key Stage 2, we might, in some models, we'd include a class average. So that's partly an attempt to deal with issues like setting, where we see, for example, in maths, setted classes having different rates of progress. We can adjust for that to some extent, at least, we hope can, by using these compositional variables. And then the other thing we're doing, which is, I think, unlike what many other studies have done because they haven't had the data, is to use concurrent scores as a control. So what we're trying to do is to predict what would we expect a typical student to achieve in, let's say, history at the end of year 9, and we know their Key Stage 2 score. We might actually know their history score at the end of year 8. We haven't used that in the models yet, but as we build up repeated years of data, we'll start to do that. We've got all those demographic variables like their pupil premium, gender, and so on. We've taken account of the class composition. What's the average Key Stage 2 across the class, but we can also take account of how well did that student do in their other subjects at the end, let's say at the end of year 9. So if we're looking at their history at the end of year 9, we can compare that with how that same student did at the same time in, let's say, French, maths, science, or whatever else we've got. And you can argue about, well, should we adjust for that, or is that part of the value that maybe the history teacher's added, if a great history teacher might help you to do better in other subjects as well. So you can argue that either way, and we've done it both ways. For primary, we've got just maths and reading. These are commercial tests, and we're estimating the trend over time, or at least that's one of the models we're using. So it's a growth model. Over the year, we've got 3 assessments. How much did each student's performance grow over the year? And then we effectively estimate that for each student in each subject, in each class, and we aggregate over the class and then over the teacher, so we can estimate the teacher. And we can also do that at the school level to estimate a school effect. In some models, again, we've got that, in others we haven't. Okay, so let me show you some graphs then. So this first one is the teacher effects. And these are the estimates of the teacher value added. Now, on the left-hand side, the line in the middle is actually dots, because there's about 1,000 teachers from this. This is just from one of the mats. So it looks like a line, but it's actually 1,000 dots going up from the left, gradually rising. And the vertical lines on that, the sort of whiskery bits, are the confidence intervals. So they're like a margin of error. And this is sometimes called a caterpillar plot for what I hope are obvious reasons. So those whiskery up and down lines tell you the margin of error. If they cross the 0 horizontal line, that means we can't really distinguish the impact that teacher's having from average. In other words, it's no different from average. And in this estimate for this mat, 84% of teachers can't really be distinguished from average from 0. They're non-significant. So the vast majority of teachers, all we can say about them is, well, you're average. And then there's a handful at the top and a handful at the bottom where we can say it looks like you've had a positive impact or a smaller impact, a negative impact. On the right, the primary, there is a bit more separation. So here we can separate 51% have non-significant, so 49 we can separate. The confidence intervals are a bit smaller and the spread is a bit bigger. That I think is because they only teach one class. So it may be that as we build up with more data from primary, actually those confidence intervals will grow. And it's a bit paradoxical because normally when you have more data, you expect to get more precision. But what it turns out is that different classes taught by the same teacher are actually quite different. And that's shown on the next chart. So this one is now showing it's the same 1,000 teachers. The red dots are the teachers' value added, again, going from the lowest to the highest, left to right. But this time, those orange dots, they're not the confidence intervals. Each orange dot is now a class taught by that teacher. So where we've got teachers teaching more than one class, which is mostly, you can see that even the teachers at the left-hand end who are the least effective, many of them are teaching classes that have made excellent progress. In fact, some of the best progress comes from teachers in the bottom half, and some of the worst progress comes from teachers in the top half. So there's a lot of variation at class level. There is variation at teacher level as well. And I think that resonates with what you know if you've taught more than one class ever, that they're very different, and the amount of progress they make and how much they learn is not the same, even though it's the same teacher teaching them. So I think maybe nice to see that in the data. I don't think too surprising, but it does mean that talking about the impact of a teacher is quite problematic because they seem to have different impacts on different classes that they teach. And then the final chart, which shows the final one I'm going to show today, although there's lots more, as I say, in the full report. This is now schools. So the black dots here are schools numbered 1 to 12, and the red dots are the teachers within that school. And again, you can see that although, yes, we can rank order the schools, there's quite a lot of variation among the teachers within a single school. And actually that amount of variation also changes a bit by which school. Some schools are relatively tightly grouped together, number 11, for example, and others are much more spread out, say number 10. The overall average performance of progress made in those two schools is pretty similar, but they're much more spread among the teachers in number 10 than there is in number 11. We don't know anything more, as I say, they're anonymous. We don't even know which schools they are, but that is one of the questions that we'll be trying to look into a bit more detail in the next rounds of the study. So if I just try and summarize what we know about this, then it is possible. We have managed to collect the data and we're getting better at doing that. There's a range of quality in the assessments. Mostly they're good or good enough, but a handful probably could be improved. We can estimate value added, we think, which enables one advantage of that is that we can now talk about value added for any teacher of any subject, which previously no one's really been able to do that. We do find that different classes taught by the same teacher vary quite a lot in their progress. we also find that if we're trying to talk about the value added or the impact of an individual teacher, there's really a lot of noise in that, and it's probably not that meaningful to talk about individual teacher value added. But fortunately, that's not what we want to do. The main thing we want to do in this project is to evaluate larger scale programs. So for example, different training routes or different specific kinds of training programs that teachers have experienced, and relationships between different factors in the model. And so they're accurate enough to allow us to do that. So I think that's quite an important distinction, that we're not trying to estimate value added for individual teachers. We can do that, but it is quite noisy. We're much more interested in looking at the success, the impact, the trajectories of teachers in terms of their impact who have followed certain types of programs. Okay, and I think that's it for me. I'm going to hand over to Sean to talk about the data and automation.
Brilliant. Thank you, Rob. And just to remind everyone, if you have any questions for Rob, the Q&A section at the top of your Teams window is available there. If you want to put your questions in there, we can pose them to Rob and myself or Raj at the end of the session. So I'm Sean Dillon, Director of Data at the National Institute of Teaching. I'm going to quickly talk you through just the data practicalities, as Rob touched on then, and what we're going to do going forward with the automation process for extracting and collecting the data. So as Rob mentioned, with Piloted, we collected the data manually, and as you can imagine, this is very time consuming, prone to errors. Luckily for us, we have fantastic data leads in our founding Mats who helped us with this process. They anonymized all of the data, got it to us, Claire and myself done the cleaning and passed to Rob, who was able to produce the paper. So that's all well and good, and we are continuing with that going forward into the TIDE project, which Raj will talk about in a second. But so running parallel to that, we are looking to automate the process, which is going to come under Automate TED. We're sort of in the pre-alpha stage of development regarding the automated data collection from our founding Mats. So we're just scoping the project and understanding the system requirements. But to do this, we are working and collaborating with Oxford University and the Bennett Institute of Applied Science. And we're going to link an education version of Open Safely. And that is something that the Bennett Institute have produced as part of the NHS research. So to speak about that, I'll mention what Open Safely is. It's a very exciting project, and I would implore everyone to Google Open Safely and have a look at the video introduced by Ben Goldacre. It's really interesting, and obviously it affects all of us with the NHS data that it consumes. But we are going to be looking at the education side of things. And so Open Safely it's an open source secure platform for the analysis of electronic health records. So we'll be looking to do the same thing with education records. We will extract the data automatically from our founding Mats. We'll store that data securely, and we will build the Open Safely section of the project on the end of that in order for researchers to access that. The most impressive part from my point of view is that the privacy and security around it. So researchers can write the code to analyze patient data without needing to view the raw records. So it obviously that minimizes the risk of data breaches, and the data is not disseminated from anywhere, so that the analysts using Open Safely do not see or tinker with the raw or real data. Instead, Open Safely gives them randomly generated fake records, which they use to write their code. Then the analyst code is ready to run. Open Safely takes that code, runs it on the real data entirely inside the secure environment, and reports back only on the results. So a large part of the automated project is the information security and the governance, and Open Safely seem to have cracked that in the NHS world, and obviously providing that security. Everything's transparent. All platform activities are publicly logged, so everyone can see all the code and the data management and analysis that's shared openly on the site for scientific review. And Open Safely requires the publication of all analytical code promoting reusable, testable, and shareable research. It was instrumental in the urgent research around COVID-19 during the pandemic, and we're looking to sort of build a database with that from our founding Mats to replicate that in support of our research at the National Institute of Teaching. So with that, again, any questions, pop them in the chat. I realise that's a whistle-stop tour of the automation process, but I will hand over to Dr. Raj Chand now to talk about the TIDE project.
Thanks, Sean. Hi, everyone. So my name's Raj. I'm a senior research associate, which just means I work on the research team at National Institute of Teaching. And I'm also a maths teacher and A-level economics teacher at a secondary school over in Hackney. Right. OK, so I'm going to talk to you about the programme Teacher Improvement Through Data and Evaluation, or TIDE, which we're going to be doing for the next few years. The objectives of TIDE are to develop a measure of teacher impact, so that we can then understand the drivers of teacher impact. And third, we're going to take what we've learnt and then we're going to try and develop and test interventions, that should say, sorry about a typo. We're going to develop and test interventions which we're going to run randomised controlled trials on, which you will have seen, for example, EEF run many RCTs over the last few years. So really what we're doing is we're putting a huge amount of effort using this data infrastructure and some work we're about to show you to design some really intelligent, well-informed interventions that we hope can improve teacher development going forward. We've got an amazing team working on this. So we're very lucky to have Rob working with us on this from the start. We've also got many other people that I'm sure you will have heard of, Sam Sims and Becky Allen, who've written books on the teacher gap. And then we've also got John Jerram at UCL. So we're really lucky to have the best there is in the UK looking at this. And more importantly, we're going to convene an expert working group. And by experts, we don't mean academics. By experts, we mean teachers. And we don't just mean teachers like me. I've only been doing it 5 years, but we mean teacher development people who've been working in the field of coaching teachers, training teachers for 20 odd years. We totally understand that whilst data can be insightful, it's only generating clues to bring towards people who are in schools every single day, right? So we're not trying to teach anyone how to suck eggs here. We're trying to understand, are there clues in the data that can help people with incredibly busy lives focus on the really high impact couple of changes that maybe they can make. Right, let's talk through a little bit how this is going to work. And this is such a complicated program over several years. So breaking it down, we're going to lose some nuance, but for the best for the way we are. Developing a measure of teacher impact. Well, you've just seen it. It's incredibly complicated what Rob's gone through. And I think I would really urge other people to go through that working paper and have a look at the short summary. But really, just to summarize what we've just seen there, we think, given the data that schools commonly hold, we think we can come up with a pretty good guess of what a pupil is going to get that year. And that guess, informed by statistics and data, is based on their prior attainment, free school meals, and so on. So what we're saying here is that if kids are doing regularly better in a teacher's class, regularly better than we statistically predict, we think there's something going on with this teacher. We think that this is an impactful teacher. Now, there's lots of other ways that teachers can have impact. I mean, we realise that pastoral teams and so on are going to have huge impact on a kid's life. But what we're thinking is that if you've got a bunch of kids that were all forecast to get a 6 at the end of their year 10 GCSE maths, and they're on 7s and 8s, something's going on with that teacher, something fantastic, and we want to find out more. So what do we want to find out? If a teacher is shooting the lights out, doing amazingly well, and in my school, certainly, post GCSEs, everybody kind of knows which teachers did amazingly well on value add. We want to know at an aggregate level across all the teachers out there, what are the things which are driving that impact? So we're going to start off just looking at what we might call their characteristics. Just a reminder, everybody here is going to be anonymized, but whilst we won't know who they are or where they're working per se, we will know their development pathway. So for example, some people have done a university PGCE, I did schools direct. And so we'll be looking, okay, does that have a noticeable impact on teacher impact? Of course, experience surely matters. I'm certainly doing the job a lot better now than I was 5 years ago. And I hope in 5 years' time, I'll be doing it better still. But understanding how that develops is going to be really interesting. I'm sure many of you will have seen a graph where you see teacher impact initially rises very, very quickly and then kind of plateaus, right? We'll be able to get, we hope, over time, repeated data on the teachers in our mats, and we'll be able to see when does his impact increase the most and when does it stop. We're interested also in not just their characteristics, because whilst we can sort of say, okay, a teacher doing this for 15 years is more impactful than a teacher doing it for 2 years, well, we'd expect that. But then, what can we do about that? We haven't got time machines. So in the end, we can't really just wait 13 years. What we then want to find out is, what is it that a teacher of 15 years is doing in practical terms that a teacher of 2 years maybe could learn from, and we could accelerate their development. We're going to find data on what they're doing from observations. Now, in your school, I know many of you are in school. In your school, some of you will have maybe some written write-up on Word. Some of you might categorize according to different competencies, whether a teacher is doing like their behavior management excellently or room for development. We're going to just gather initially from our expert working group and from schools and say, right, how do you manage observations? What kind of records do you keep? Now, this is going to give us a jumbled, I mean, Rob's had a job on just assembling all those assessments into something that you can analyze. We're going to have even more of a job on taking all of these different written observations and turning it into something that we can meaningfully analyze and say, well, the high impact teachers are doing this and others maybe could learn from it. So this is where the wizardry of AI and machine learning will come into it. We're going to work with an organization called Faculty AI, and their fancy robots, you can tell I'm not a technical person, is going to watch. It's either going to read all of these different lesson observations and sort of codify, turn that into data and say, do you know what? The high impact teachers are getting behavior right and they're doing live in class marking, because that's what seems to be there. And we're going to try another thing, which is experimental, but maybe not that far away. Lesson recordings became increasingly common in my school, certainly during COVID. And many schools have that technology lying around just collecting dust. We're going to dust that off and try and bring some microphones back into some classrooms with obvious permissions granted from those people that need to give them. And we're going to take those enormous lesson transcripts, and the robots are going to read all that or listen to it all and turn that into data. And then it can tell us these high impact teachers are asking this many questions, or these high impact teachers are waiting this long for an answer. This high impact teacher, if they ask a question, then bounces it around off other students to get a better answer, or maybe they don't, right? So we're going to try and take those millions of things that teachers are doing all the time and try and turn that into a data set so we can learn which of those decisions are leading to impactful results and which of them are not. I could talk about that for hours. I'm going to move on. We're also going to try and learn something about schools. So schools have huge variation in the way they deliver their CPD. Schools have variation, and there's a movement at the moment towards everybody having centralized booklets. But even then, what's the nature of these booklets? What are they used for? And of course, lots of schools won't. Also, schools will vary in terms of the way they do their timetabling. Who is it that gets the lower set maths classes in year 8? Is it the experienced teachers or the less experienced teachers? We'll also be looking at things like a practice called looping. I've got a year 10 maths class. I taught them last year as well, and I'll also go on to teach them in year 11. So where you have the same teacher all the time, we call that looping, and we're interested in whether or not that is associated with higher impact. So we would love to hear your hypotheses as well, that if we can find this meaningful teacher impact measure, that they're really generating value add. If you've got suggestions on where that might be coming from, we'd love to hear it. Please put it in the chat, or the Q&A, I should call it. Likewise, if there are other things where you're like, I don't think how this thing is relevant, or you think the whole enterprise is doomed for something we've missed, we'd like questions on all of that as well, please. If we just move on to what we're going to do after that, please. Right, so touch wood, in 2026 or 2027, we're going to have tons and tons of insights of different factors, whether it's teacher characteristics, the things they're doing in the classroom, or the things their schools are doing, that seems to be associated with higher impact. Now, we're not just going to put that out there. Many people are familiar with randomized controls trial now, and knowing that you can't just rely on correlations. What we're going to do is we're going to take those insights and we're going to work with our expert working group and said, right, given what we've learned here about which practices and which school practices seem to be generating higher impact, what practical changes could we feasibly make in the way that we're developing teachers? And those changes could occur at the National Institute of Teaching level in terms of our initial teacher training or our CPD, or it might even occur just at the internal way that a school is running its observations or running its mentoring, right? So if we just flick on down the slide a little bit, please. So all of these different things are going to be candidates for changes, interventions, which we're then going to run on large-scale randomized controlled trials. And if some of them happen to be successful, we will then share them with everybody in the sector and say, well, this is what we've learned. This is how we turned it into a practical change. We randomly tested it in our own schools, and these are the positive effects that we found, with a complete playbook of how we do the whole lot. So that's our plan for the next 4 years. Quite a lot of work set out in front of us. And that's it for the time being. So now it'd be good just to have some questions from you. And we've also got some commonly asked questions which we can anticipate and get ahead of the game. So Claire, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rob, Sean and Raj, for that. Right, so everybody watching this then, now is your chance to put any thoughts or questions into that Q&A. If you put any thoughts in there, there's some interesting points coming out already, but we will be using this and looking at it in more detail after the webinar, particularly as we move further into the project as well. So we're very keen to get all thoughts on this. So just to get us going then, and I think that this one is for you, Rob. What do you do about different school contexts? Because obviously some schools are much harder to work in than others. And is it fair to judge teachers as if they were all the same?
Okay, yeah, great question. So first of all, we're not judging teachers. There's no kind of value attached to this. There's certainly not any individual teachers. There's certainly no consequences attached to any of that. So I think that's important to bear in mind, that there's, it doesn't matter to any individual whether that this is context is adequately adjusted for or not, although obviously we need to do that. And the answer is, well, we're doing the same things that everybody else does in terms of things like using pupil premium status at the individual pupil level and at the group level. Those are the kinds of indicators people have used. Lots of reasons to think that may not be great, though. So what else can we do? Well, there may be other things that we can put in. There are certainly one of the things we want to do over time is to be able to track the same teachers as they move between schools. So at the moment, that's going to work if they stay within the same multi-academy trust. We'll be able to know that it's the same teacher. If they move across trust, that may be a bit more problematic, but it still might be possible to do that. And there aren't many studies where people have done this, but it really matters to see, well, if you're a really effective teacher in one context, are you still an effective teacher according to the models we've got in another context? And if that's not the case, then what we'll know is we're measuring something that's more about the context than it is about the individual expertise of that teacher. But I think it's fair to say we don't know the answer to that yet. We're putting in the same sorts of controls and adjustments that anybody else has ever done. So it's as good as previous work on this. We want it to be even better, and it will be as we get more data over time.
Thanks, Rob. And another one for you, which is related to that one. Any plans to explore the influence of variables such as SEN, gender, EAL and ethnicity on proposed value add? We can observe the influence of pupil demographics on school level outcomes, which may have some subsequent effects on class composition.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. We've got a long list of questions around that. So we have already got variables like, well, we've got pupil premium, we've got SEN status, we've got gender, we've got EAL status. Those are all in the data sets already, and we've taken account of those both at the individual pupil level and at the class percentage, if you like, level. We can also do that at school level, but there are so many questions. So for example, do children who are flagged as having SEN status, do they typically receive or experience teachers of the same distribution of quality as students who are not flagged as SEN? We don't know the answer to that, but once we've taken account of those variables in the model, we can ask that question and say, well, what types of teachers do each type of student get? We can do that by prior attainment as well, or pupil premium or other characteristics. Who's getting what we think are the best teachers, if you like, and who's getting typically the less effective teachers? Are there differences in terms of equity there? So there's any number of questions that we can get to. And as Raj said, if people have got questions that they think, oh, this is an interesting, powerful data set, be really useful to know about, here's my question. We'd be delighted to have those questions and to answer them if we can.
Thank you. Right, Raj, one for you then. When you say by experts, we don't mean academics, what's the rationale for risk of excluding the contributions of teacher education academics alongside expert teachers? And that's coming from a university teacher educator.
Thank you for that.
Previously an AST.
So I'm apologies for that. I've had a long day teaching myself, and I just said the wrong thing. I didn't mean we won't have academics. I just meant we won't just have academics. So what I was really keen to communicate here is that this is a collaborative effort between academics like Rob and others who I showed you, also teacher development experts who are working within National Institute of Teaching and have been for a long time, and also others in the sector who are already on our strategic advisory board. So there's definitely a broad range of opinions here. By no means is it exclusively one group. So my fault, sorry, a bit sloppy there by missing out the word only. So not just academics.
Thank you for clarifying that, Raj. And then another one, which came through at the point when, Raj, you were mentioning AI. See if I can find it. How can we remove unconscious bias from that? I'm assuming the AI models or the quality of the observer.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, that's difficult anyway. And as the questioner may know, a very live issue in terms of AI as it is. So it's very early days, and this is something we would work with faculty on, and everything would be published about how we do it. But the thing we would imagine is we're training artificial intelligence using human experts. So several human experts would be watching a lesson and conducting a live observation of it and categorizing it in various different ways. And so the algorithm is learning from the judgment of experienced observers of teachers. And so if the experienced observers of teachers are all saying this behavior management is excellent, the algorithm is learning, oh, this lesson where you see this is excellent. Now, it's a good question to ask, and we have to be tentative with quite a lot of this. We don't 100% know it's going to work. A lot of promises of artificial intelligence are we might be able to do it. So the question of bias is a big issue. The way we try and avoid it is it's trained with human experts in the first place and with continuous human expert quality assurance.
Thank you for that. And then this might be an interesting one. Does this take into account the children who may receive additional support or intervention outside of the normal classroom and are therefore not the sole responsibility of the class teacher? Maybe Rob or Raj to answer that one.
Well, let me have a go. So that is a definite real challenge. One of the things people have said, well, what about tutoring, say, outside or things like that? Kids get great GCSE marks, not because of the teaching they've received in school, but because of outside help. This would also apply to various kinds of within school interventions where kids are given extra support in different ways. Now, in principle, yes, it may be possible to capture that and estimate the effect of it. At the moment, we haven't done that. And so that's definitely something we need to bear in mind. I think one of the things that we're hoping, or maybe an assumption that we can test out, it'd be interesting to know what people think about this, is that although these things do happen, and they will certainly affect a number of children, that on average they will be it'll sort of come out in the wash that some teachers will have students who will benefit from this, but they'll have those in every class, or overall all teachers benefit from that in some way. So if we're looking at the average performance of children taught by a particular teacher, it matters that these things balance out. It doesn't matter that there's maybe one or two individuals where the result they got wasn't really attributable to the teacher. It might have been attributable to other things as well.
Okay, and then this is an interesting one regarding Key Stage 2 data. because we've been working with a lot of Key Stage 2 data where we can get it, bearing in mind that SATs didn't take place during COVID. But where Key Stage 2 data does not exist, do external tests such as CAT4 and ALICE tests work as good estimators for performance?
Yes. Oh, sorry.
No, go on, Rob.
Oh, I was going to say just yes, as long as the data's in the school's MIS, then we can get it, we can use it, and if it gives a good prediction, then it makes sense to include it in the model. So absolutely, yes, those kinds of assessments, commercial assessments or other kinds of standardized assessments that schools use, as long as the data's in the MIS or in some electronic form, then in principle we can match it up and use it, and we'd certainly hope to do that.
Okay, and then this one is a meaty one. Okay, great project, but one hell of an undertaking, he says here. So how confident are we that this will work, particularly the use of AI in the project and the project in general, or tell us anything new that we don't already know? Do we have hypotheses to test? Raj?
Yes, absolutely correct. It's an enormous project. And how confident are we that this will work? Well, varying degrees of confidence in different bits of it. The AI element, I think we're quite explicitly tentative about it. We don't know. We're going to try, but we honestly don't know. Now, we're working with faculty who've got a brilliant track record of solving problems like this, so we'll see. Do we have a hypothesis to test, or like, is this going to tell us something we don't already know? You know, I don't know, but that implies to me that there is a shared understanding of what it is that we do know. And I'm not sure as a teacher that that is the case. So I, for example, I mean, like my school's pretty good. It's got a pretty specific rubric for observations, and I'm observed across 9 different competencies. But I don't think there's any agreement over which of them is the most important. And so if you're a new teacher, and I certainly felt this, I was just thinking, well, what is it that I should prioritize getting on top of? Is it behavior? Is it marking? Is it the way I'm explaining stuff? Is it questioning? And I've talked to people like Rob, who's been, in this game a long time looking at it, and other people like Josh Goodrich at Step Lab, who's trying to like come up with a framework for developing new teachers. And even also Doug Lemov in Teach Like a Champion, that very few people have a very confident belief in, if I'm a new teacher, I want to be able to do these 4 or 5 things first. And that is what, in a dream world, we would love to be able to produce at the end, which is, if you're a new teacher in the first couple of years, try and get on top of these things. And then we can maybe reduce the cognitive load on new teachers by not asking them to do 50 things, which realistically nobody does anyway, but actually just say, right, this is a short and coherent view towards improving your development quicker. Will it work? We don't know. It's a difficult project and it is new, but this is the nature of research. If we were certain it was going to work, it wouldn't be research really. So yeah, I don't know if Rob, if you had anything else to add on that very good question and right.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a good challenge and good to be presented with that. I mean, I actually think we've already discovered things that we didn't know. So when we were talking about setting this up, I discussed this with a lot of other experts. And one of the concerns they had was that the kind of internal assessments, the homemade assessments that trusts use, wouldn't be good enough. They wouldn't be universally of high enough quality to support this kind of analysis. And I think we've now shown that for the most part, they are good enough. They do meet those basic standards. So people didn't know that before. It's always hard, when people tell you the results of a study, you think, oh, that was obvious. But if you ask people to predict before you tell them what they think the result will be, it's often quite different from what you find. So I think there's quite a few things here that we didn't know before that we would have guessed were not the way they've turned out to be. And we can already say, actually, for example, about the quality of internal assessments, they're pretty good.
Thank you. And then the other part of that question, sorry, I split it up into chunks because it has quite a few bits to it. What does success look like at the end, and how will this improve teaching and student outcomes? And are we planning to come up with a proposed model, or kind of toolkit for what a good teacher profile looks like and what a good assessment looks like? Rob or Raj?
I don't mind just jumping in on this one. We would love to, yes, provide not necessarily a model. We want to avoid going, a good teacher just looks like this. That's just not going to be the case. And I think Rob was sort of showing this is noisy data and we're not quite sure. But what we'd love to be able to say is some of these training routes do seem to be like contributing some higher than expected impact. And we'd hope that's the case. Otherwise, none of it means anything, in which case, they're all the same. And that doesn't feel right. So we would hope to be able to give some clues about the kinds of training which are generating high impact and the kinds of practices. And the ideal legacy of it is that we put together an intervention showing, okay, this is how we can implement mentoring in schools. This is how we can implement observation and coaching, and then make that shareable to absolutely everybody. So that would be our ideal that other people could then use. It's possible that despite our best efforts, and we see this often with the EEF, many trials in the end do not work. But again, that's useful knowledge. If we can take all of these insights and say, do you know what, we tried doing this, we can just share, and it didn't actually make all that much difference to pupil outcomes. That might be quite useful for school leaders who are considering putting hundreds of hours into that approach, right? So as long as we can contribute to the knowledge about where impactful teaching is coming from, personally, I consider that a success.
Okay. Rob, anything to add to that one?
No, I think that's a great answer. I mean, I agree. I think there's all sorts of things. It's like any other project. We don't exactly know what we're going to find. I definitely don't think there's likely to be a sort of template for what you have to do to be a great teacher. I think we know already that there's many different ways to be great. But as Raj said, if there are certain key things at certain points in the career that are the most important to master, to get on top of, that would be very useful knowledge. And I think that is the kind of thing that we may be able to contribute. And certainly around these interventions, if we can get to that point, hopefully we can find some things that do make a difference. It won't be dramatic, it won't be transformational, it will be small incremental changes through doing things that are scalable, and that's really valuable knowledge.
And then just two more questions then. Is there anything similar happening in other countries, or is this unique to the UK? Rob.
Okay, yes, I think it's pretty unique. There's a lot of work being done on teacher value added in the US. They have massive data sets which are now have become very widely available. They're mostly done in elementary and middle schools, so the sort of lower end of Key Stage 3 and 2 probably is our equivalent. They're almost all done in math and reading. So and there are I think there's one study we found that had looked at internal assessments and certainly not done as much with it as what we've already done. So we don't know much about, there's a couple of studies, literally about 3 or 4 studies that have looked at teacher value added in the UK, or indeed anywhere outside of the US. It's a tiny handful of studies. So, and there are lots of really important differences between the way schools are set up in the UK and in England in particular, and in other countries like the US. So I don't think we can assume that all those findings will be the same. So I think, yes, there's masses we can learn here. I don't think there's anything quite like it anywhere in the world, certainly not on this kind of scale, certainly not, and this is a really important feature of this work, that with the kind of school-led involvement in it, this is very much led by the trusts, led by the teachers involved. The researchers are obviously doing the analysis, but the agenda is very much set by a school-led organisation. So I don't think there's anything quite like it, actually. But as always, I love to be proved wrong on a claim like that. So if anybody does know, please do tell me.
Okay, and then a final one then. Sean, this one is going to you. Can schools, teachers, academy trusts not linked with the National Institute of Teaching get involved in this project, and how?
Yes, yeah. So as mentioned, we'll be getting the automation etc. ready with Oxford and the Bennett Institute first. We'll do all our testing and things like that to make sure we can get that, because we don't want to. What we don't want to do is increase workload in anyone we invite to join us or who request to join us. So yes, once that is up and running and we've tested it and we know it's working, we'll be looking for more data. The more data, the better we can get for Rob et al. to analyse. And I think there's a slide at the end of this presentation with how you get in touch with that. Is that right, Claire? The research email address? Yeah, so feel free to contact us on the research email address, and we can take it from there. But absolutely, yes, it's not limited to the FMATs. It's just in the current pre-alpha stages that we're working on.
Okay, and then just check the clock. Sorry, I was a bit ahead of myself there. And then there's a couple coming through just now about when we're looking at pathways for teacher training, will it be a case of this pathway's good, this pathway's bad? And Raj, can you say a bit more about why it doesn't feel right that all IT pathways could have equal potential? So what's the rationale for thinking it's the pathway itself rather than the individual teacher education happening in the IT relationship or the type of student teacher recruited that is key?
Yeah, this is a really good question. So when I just sort of said I would be surprised if all pathways were the same, that's just my hunch, and my hunch is not really particularly important here. The objective of the project is to get the data together and see, does the data suggest some pathways are more likely to be impactful than others? It may just be that actually it's not the case, or nothing at least that our data can predict, in which case nothing will be statistically significant, and so I might be completely wrong on that. In terms of the level of detail that we'll look at, I think this is a really good point. We don't yet know what kind of data we'll be able to get. So like, what kind of level of resolution, what kind of level of detail will it be at? It's not actually something that we've collected yet from the MATs. We know that schools typically will hold data on what qualification their teachers did, but will they know the name of the institution or just a PGCE or Schools Direct? That we don't know. And anything that we would write about that would obviously be subject to the quality of the data that we can obtain. We are very, very, very sensitive to the fact that anything we put out there may have spillover effects. And so hopefully we're trying to convince people here, we're trying to be very, very cautious in terms of what we can say about the data, and also trying to make sure that anonymity is guaranteed should there be any negative spillover effects. We're keen also to work with various teacher education providers to make sure that we're doing this in the right way. So if you've got any continued concerns about what you're hearing, we'd rather just talk to you immediately so we can hear the concerns and deal with them up front, because we absolutely do not want to just be going out there and saying something which has spillover, unintended consequences. We'd like to be careful and working in partnership.
Just to add one thought to that, I think one of the things we do know is that students who go into different routes are quite different at the beginning. And so if we find differences at the end of a training program, it's hard to know whether that's a result of the impact of the training or whether it's because of those initial differences. So we're definitely very aware of that as a challenge. We can't just look at who's coming out of different training programs and what are they, what impact do they have straight away. But I do think one of the ways we can address this is by looking at their trajectories after that. So do people who've come through certain routes improve quicker? Let's put it like that. Do they overtake others who came through a route where perhaps that were more selective, for example? I don't know. We can also learn more about the ways that people recruit and select, both into training programs and into other teaching jobs. There's no end of questions that I think this work has a potential to shed light on. But I agree, we do have to be really careful about making sure if we're making what might be interpreted as causal claims about particular training routes, that we have the evidence that supports that. And in general, we probably won't have that in a very strong form.
That's lovely, thank you. Right, so 1 minute to go. Thank you to everybody for coming along this afternoon, and to our speakers for presenting. Thank you for all the brilliant questions that are coming through as well, and comments. And there's people saying that they'd like to get in touch with Rob in particular as well to get more involved. If you want to find out more about our programmes and the research that we do at the NIOT, then you can scan that QR code there, which will take you to a page where you can choose what you would like to receive updates on, or you can email the research team directly at research@niot.org.uk if you have any further questions or would like to be involved in the conversations about this research in particular that we've talked about this afternoon, or in other research projects that we're working on. Thanks again for joining us this afternoon, and I hope that you found it interesting, and we hope to see you all again very soon. Thank you.